What lies ahead in ASEAN 4.0? Held at MAX Atria at the Singapore EXPO on March the 1st, Asean Connect 2018 explored how digitalization will continue to redefine ASEAN's growth trajectory. Over 200 regional business leaders and industry influencers gathered here to share their insights on upcoming market trends in light of the fourth industrial revolution. Let's have a look.
If I look at the world today, like what are the major production centers in the world, you see that China is the world's biggest economy. You see that China accounts for 18% of world GDP. It's the world's largest economy. The US is the second largest. China actually overtook the US a couple of years ago. The US is at 15%. ASEAN is about 6% of the world economy today. What would the world look like, in the future? Well, think of a future where all countries in the world essentially did a Singapore. Now, what does that mean? It means that, Singapore started off as a poor country in the 1950s and 60s. It's a bona fide growth miracle, okay? And it grew very fast, and today it's richer than the US, okay? So what would the world look like if all countries in the world did a Singapore, okay? So they all grew fast and caught up to the levels of development, let's say, of the US. So all countries in the world essentially have the same per capita income, so the per capita GDP of the US, okay? In that world, essentially, if all countries have the same per capita GDP, then whichever country has bigger population, they're going to be producing more goods. India and China would be the giants, close to about 20% of the world. The rise of the US as a major production center. And this is likely to happen in our lives. One thing I also want to emphasize is that even though we put all the countries inside ASEAN, there is actually no one ASEAN. The growth challenges for each of these countries is very, very different. So let me first show you some data on how the US has grown since 1870. The US is sitting on this technological frontier, and this technological frontier gets driven out through innovation, and this has been happening for the past 145 years. Today it's in AI and robotics. Before that, it was in the IT sector. Before that, it was in the financial sector. Before that, it was in telecommunications, going all the way back to the original industrial revolution in the 18th century. So the US has a very particular way of doing innovation, which is this process of creative destruction, new firms, new industries rising up, being created, destroying the old firms, destroying the old industries, and this is what is driving out this technological frontier. Many countries want to mimic this. Every country wants to be Silicon Valley. Not many countries are able to mimic this because it requires a bunch of things like the infrastructure to innovate, the institutions to innovate, the risk preferences, which are not so easily mimicked. Okay, so that's the US. So think of the US as the benchmark. Think of this as what the advanced economies should worry about. China is very close to this innovation window now. China has to start worrying about innovation. As it switches from this investment-driven growth to innovation-driven growth, its growth rates are naturally going to slow down. So the slowdown in growth rates that you see in China are actually to be expected. If I go to Singapore and South Korea and Hong Kong, you see it is a very, very similar story. If I look at countries like India, Vietnam, Indonesia, these countries are pretty far from the technological frontier. So all they need to worry about is essentially getting investment. And here politics plays a big role. If you can't get political stability right, if you cannot have a good legal system in place, if you don't have corruption under control, if you don't have good regulatory quality, then what's going to happen is that investment will not show up in your country because you're too risky. These are hard to change, but there are some things which are easy to change where you just make it easier to do business, okay? Easier to start a firm, easier to move goods through customs. So we also have these doing business indicators, which is about starting businesses, paying taxes, trading across borders. These can be changed with the stroke of a pen. As an economist, if I see a country every year improving its doing business indicators, it gives me a signal that at least the leadership is serious about reforms and that this would be a good place to invest in. Here are most of the ASEAN countries. Vietnam has the most growth potential amongst the ASEAN countries. They're very far from this technological frontier. Are they going to realize this growth potential? Well, they need to attract investment. How are they doing? You can see that Vietnam has been investing in the past 15 years on average 30% of its GDP. India has been investing 32% of its GDP, Indonesia 28%. So these countries are fine. Philippines has not invested sufficient amount. So Philippines, though people are extremely optimistic about Philippines in the last 2 years, but I'm looking again at long-term trends, it hasn't invested enough, neither has Malaysia. Question, of course, is are they going to sustain these investment rates going forward? And for that, I need to essentially look at institutions.
After the break, find out how the digital era has impacted ASEAN's trade and the service industry. What will digitalization bring to ASEAN's trading table and the service industry? We hear from the experts.
We see this backlash, as you mentioned, about concerns relating to globalization generally. And this has come from mainly the industrialized countries, the richer Western industrialized countries, but also you hear whispers about it even in this region. For instance, in Indonesia, even Philippines, and so on, there are concerns. And I think these relate to the distributional impacts of trade more than anything else. We know that trade is mutually beneficial, right? But it's not always fair, right? There are winners and losers between countries and within countries, right? And we need to try and ensure that the workers that get displaced by rapid changes coming from openness are helped, reskilled to re-enter the workforce in new growing sectors as all sectors contract. So I think that's where the challenge lies. And it's probably the biggest challenge going forward, addressing the growing displacement, which is reflected in growing inequality within countries. The inequality between countries in ASEAN are narrowing. We know that because the poorest countries are growing much faster than the richer ones.
So for the past 20 years, Singapore, we have a very famous system called TradeNet. It allows companies to declare once for all import-export transshipment and get it approved by all government agencies within minutes. Till today, this is still one of the efficient systems in the world. However, we are not happy with just that because we look at the whole supply chain landscape, it is still very fragmented. And we are asking ourselves, how can we help the Singapore-based companies to grow? This is where, in the new era, we're looking at how to provide a digital trade platform that is neutral and secure for our companies to leverage on one another, to be able to reach out to overseas players, to be able to reuse the digital data for all the downstream preparation, thereby improve their efficiency.
If we're talking about ASEAN, there is a younger population. So a lot of these SMEs are actually run by very young people, and it will continue to do. You know, these are digital natives. So I don't think there we're going to have an issue. But you're right, a lot of Asian family businesses are very old-fashioned. And for that, we still have the traditional.
So old-fashioned doesn't mean they are not innovative.
Sure,
they're actually fantastic innovators. But digitalization is another way.
It's slow. It's a cultural shift. So I think, I mean, we still have the very traditional trade-offs, right? All banks do. We still have all of that. But unless we as a collaborator and a leader start to use different tools, they'll never change. So we see that as kind of an enforcement, not a requirement, but an encouragement to go there. And I think as long as government, private sector, banks all do that, then I think businesses will follow as well. But also in terms of the trade tracker, we find that SME, smaller companies tend to use that more. Because if you look at the multinational corporations, you know, they've got tons of people in the operations team and they go to the office and they still transact. But it's actually the SMEs who like using that better. Because they do everything, right? They wear so many hats.
I'll jump in on that. I think you're right, because the bigger companies, for example, we serve all the big companies. They don't have to track. We track it for them. We only highlight whatever is going wrong. Whatever is going right, they don't have to know. So these are the kind of things, right? So it's actually outsourcing. But when you look at the SMEs, then they have a challenge, right? So that's why you are getting, and that's a traction of the space that we should be actually focusing to actually level them up. I think very important. In terms of your attitude thing you're talking about, how do we get people to think, how do we get people to move? It's not easy. Singapore is undergoing now what we call the future economy, right? So what is the future economy going to be, right? The skills and the jobs and everything else. So how are we transforming enterprises? So government actually has to play a very important role in doing that. So which is why Singapore, if you look at it, our budget today, there's a lot in terms of innovation, a lot in terms of how we can actually create what we call the mentality of shared services, right? Instead of having one person pay for $1 million, can a million people pay maybe $2, you know, that kind of thing. So if you have that kind of thing and trying to create what we call pervasive innovation, right, then I think we have a hope, right, of trying to create what we call prosperity for all, leveling up inclusive growth, making the SME leveling the playing field.
If you look from a consumption perspective and look at the data over the last 5 to 6 years across each of the key ASEAN markets, what's interesting to see is the rate at which consumption of services has outgrown the consumption of goods in ASEAN. What does all of this mean in terms of the transformation of goods business to services, or services businesses in terms of reimagination of what services of tomorrow are going to be? In the world of customers, the problem statements tend to be largely around how do I leverage the client franchise to build utilities or build better connections? In the world of platforms, how do I look at trade-oriented plays and also plays that allow me to co-create going forward? And lastly, but very importantly, in the world of data, how do I think through this from the lens of decisions and outcome as the new additional sources of competitive advantages that businesses are exploring as they gradually transform from goods businesses to a service business or services businesses reimagining services?
In so many ways, Philippines has a unique kind of economy. We are a developing country, but the economy is largely a service sector economy. And it is fueled because of there's over 12 million Filipinos living and working overseas, and they're sending money back home. There's a lot of services in the Philippines. It should be agrarian and then jumping into industrial and then jumping into the information service economy. But we kind of jump away from industrial. There's not a lot of manufacturing going on. So the shift into the service economy is affecting us greatly, especially with the BPO, the rise of the BPOs, call centers, software development. Also, this new thing called freelance work, where some websites like Upwork are making a big impact in hundreds of thousands of Filipinos finding jobs for companies in Europe and the United States and Australia. So it's having a really big impact. And government is trying to catch up with regulation because how do we tax these? You know, how do we, right now, even though there's still no consensus how the government's going to deal with, you know, this shift. So for us, as an economy largely dependent on services, it's having a very big impact.
What I see the trend is that the service providers that we as consumers cannot live without are banking, insurance, telco services, and many of the necessities in retail, travel, and hospitality. And those services actually are more pressured to reinvent themselves because of the data-driven economy. And so if you're going through a massive digital transformation, what does that mean in terms of, you know, working with cloud service providers, and how do you manage to build a hybrid model from your legacy and deep infrastructure that you've invested millions of dollars in over the last 20, 30 years. So I used to sell to IT, talking about cost savings, optimization, virtualization, and so forth. Now it's all about revenue generation. How do I build better relationships with my customers? And this is where the pain point is in most of the service providers.
We've been the market leader for the longest time. So that makes it even more challenging to ask everybody to make the changes. So what we do is that we grow in several ways. We make improvement in several ways. I think you have heard also that we collaborate with Gojek so that our customers can have another way of getting our services. So the way we see this new technology coming in, or the new business model that come into our industry as a way to expand our service instead of, you know, being defensive and no, they cannot be around. We should really embrace this new way of doing businesses.
If we look at across the causeway to Malaysia, there are a couple of projects that again stand out. They have started working with Alibaba on the traffic mind solution, which looks at cloud, pulls in data from Grab, Uber, and of course their own systems to ensure that they can do better analysis around the traffic. Most of the Asian cities need these kind of solutions around traffic for the simple reason that we are all getting a lot more cars on the roads now. Or their e-Ladang project, which is also interesting because they're bringing technology to the agriculture sector. So they're bringing IoTs, sensors into a whole range of farming areas and ensuring that the farmers can gain from it. So not overall a great example like Estonia, where they really started from scratch, and in 2 decades they have become the world's most digitally connected economy. But their governments pretty much in many countries that are looking to learn from them and ensuring that stay ahead of the curve.
When we return, we'll learn about the reality of cyber threats in ASEAN and hear what regional companies are doing to leapfrog in ASEAN's booming e-commerce sector. How real is the cyber threat in ASEAN for the individual and for organizations? And how do regional companies leapfrog in ASEAN's booming e-commerce sector? Let's find out.
Data is itself a form of currency today. You did also discuss inherently some of the weaknesses with it being malleable and open to attack, I guess. How can such a form of currency be regulated then?
Well, I don't think it is going to be regulated. In fact, Pandora's box, has been opened up. Why has iPhone and Apple and Google been so popular? Because they do the thinking for you. Everybody in this last generation doesn't want to do any critical thinking for itself. I want you to intuitively know what I want to buy, what I want to do. There's so much data being collected on everybody, and it's willingly given away.
So what's at stake if no one is paying attention already?
Well, it's the old story. You want to lose your freedoms? You're giving them away. The next world war, won't probably be won or lost by the firing of a bullet. It'll be done by cyber. And all I have to do is shut down your electricity. We're all familiar with email compromise fraud, but that's not where the real heavy hit is. If I'm an anarchist, if I really want to disrupt things, I'm not a thief, I'm an anarchist. What happens if I hack into the overnight repo market in the banks, and I hack the ledgers? And I don't steal anything, I just manipulate the ledgers. There goes your overnight borrowing market and your credit markets. So there's so many ways that you can be attacked and hacked, and what makes it dangerous. But I think, again, the only way to truly effectively defend yourself is to be constantly scanning your data and identifying attacks in real time, and then countering the attack by nullifying the threat. The other thing that doesn't happen enough is there's not enough what I call random virtue testing, both of your people and of your systems. Everybody's scared of making a reportable event if they're a regulated entity. And that's part of the problem. The regulators shouldn't punish firms for self-identifying and self-reporting when there's either a human component that's caused a problem or a mechanical or technical problem. And so it actually forces companies not to be too proactive because they don't want to create a fine against themselves. And I think that's where the regulators have to play it a little smarter and encourage a more principle-based governance, whether it be cyber or money laundering or financial crime.
Given this whole thing that ASEAN is going to be big, and give me some examples of why you are bullish about consumers in the country that you're representing, and why you think you might leapfrog.
Out of more than 260 million people is actually disconnect to the digital things. For example, only about 32% of the population in Indonesia is actually bankable. Can you imagine that? Second, it's about how big the agronomy business in Indonesia, how big the fishery industry in Indonesia. At the moment on the e-commerce, they started with the only tertiary product. It's not come to the level of the secondary and primary product. But the good part is actually for the last 3 years, the startup company in Indonesia been already showing the good cases. Already 3 unicorn in the startup: Gojek, Traveloka, Tokopedia. Actually, we are coming in. Another one is actually Bukalapak, right? But the most interesting is that to give the uniqueness value proposition to the consumer is actually Gojek.
Like in the Philippines, the disconnect there is that there are more phones than Filipinos. And mind you, we saw the Google report. It's about Filipinos spend about 5 hours a day on their phones, mostly on social media. But imagine if your product is present there.
Right.
That gives you the exposure of over 41 million people looking at your product and buying and the capability of buying it online. So to leapfrog, there's so many possibilities for the MSMEs. I've seen other services ongoing in the Philippines, like there's this, you've heard of Uber, right? Mm-hmm. There's an Uber for nurses and home care services in the Philippines where you can order and have a nurse come over to your place when needed for home care.
Also, an interesting fact, which might surprise you. So if we think about customer behavior online, we actually see it in all of Southeast Asia. People shop during working hours, with one exception, which is Singapore, actually. So in Singapore, we see a recent study from iPress actually show that purchasing actually ramped up starting maybe 4 p.m., really coming to full speed at 6 p.m. And with actually its peak at 10 p.m. And now I know that basically shopping hours of most of the malls here in Singapore are pretty generous, but 10 a.m. 10 p.m. they actually close. So if that is the peak, and actually shopping continues to 2 a.m., it's actually quite an interesting thing for SMEs to know that actually expanding, for example, their sales also to online, doing both offline and online, they can really capture the whole customer demand that is also in the late hours.
You know, especially in Thailand, right? Most of the business is centralized in Bangkok. And outside Bangkok is actually, we will see a big gap compared Bangkok and outside Bangkok. And today, actually, what actually today the government try to do is to how to help people outside Bangkok and to be success.
Yep.
So of course, Thailand 4.0 is one of the strategy that they're trying to do. And of course, the government trying to encourage more innovation company, tech company, to be helping people that outside the Thailand, how they can grow the business through technology. Because of outside Thailand, of course, when we talk about logistics, when we talk about the locations, it may not be really having an advantage on that. So then technology is a part that actually will helping on it.